Well, welcome everyone to our next session of our Bible study on Job, chapter 1, verses 1 to 22. We're going to carry on by rereading the passage. There once was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job. That man was blameless and upright, one who feared God and turned away from evil. There were born to him 7 sons and 3 daughters. He had 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 donkeys, and very many servants. So this man was the greatest of all the people in the East. His sons used to go and hold feasts in one another's houses in turn, and they would send and invite their 3 sisters to eat and drink with them. And when the feast days had run their course, Job would send and sanctify them, and he would rise early in the morning and offer burnt offerings according to the number of them all. For Job said, "It may be that my children have sinned and cursed God in their hearts." This is what Job always did. One day, the heavenly beings came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them. The Lord said to Satan, "Where have you come from?" Satan answered the Lord, "From going to and fro on the earth, and from walking up and down on it." The Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job? There is no one like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and turns away from evil." Then Satan answered the Lord, "Does Job fear God for nothing? Have you not put a fence around him and his house and all that he has on every side? You have blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land. But stretch out your hand now and touch all that he has, and he will curse you to your face." The Lord said to Satan, "Very well, all that he has is in your power, only do not stretch out your hand against him." So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord. One day, when his sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in the eldest brother's house, a messenger came to Job and said, "The oxen were plowing, and the donkeys were feeding beside them, and the Sabaeans fell on them and carried them off and killed the servants with the edge of the sword. I alone have escaped to tell you." While he was still speaking, another came and said, "The fire of God fell from heaven and burned up the sheep and the servants and consumed them. I alone have escaped to tell you." While he was still speaking, another came and said, "The Chaldeans formed 3 columns, made a raid on the camels and carried them off, and killed the servants with the edge of the sword. I alone have escaped to tell you." While he was still speaking, another came and said, "Your sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in the eldest brother's house." And suddenly a great wind came across the desert, struck the 4 corners of the house, and it fell on the young people. They are dead. I alone have escaped to tell you." Then Job arose, tore his robe, shaved his head, and fell on the ground and worshipped. He said, "Naked I have come from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return there. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." In all this, Job did not sin or charge God with wrongdoing. Well, as I said in our first session, that was hardly a cheery story. It hasn't got any cheerier as I've read it during the week either. And I know the questions that I sent you in preparation for this are not easy questions to answer. But sometimes our faith is like that, right? Sometimes our faith comes up with difficult questions to answer, and it doesn't mean that we can just push them aside and come out with um, with simple answers to things at times. Our faith requires some hard work some days, and this is one of those passages. I believe in a God that is good, period, without the negatives attached to that. I believe in a God that is good. And I find it really hard to understand how God interacts with Satan in this passage and allows this to happen to Job. There are times that I step back and I look at the stories in the Bible, and I could argue that there's a development of God over the course of the stories, and like any character development, it's not a straight line. The way our own characters and personalities develop, it's not a straight line either, right? But if we look at the beginning of the biblical narrative, we get Adam and Eve in the garden, and everything's paradise. And then God gets mad at Adam and Eve and throws them out of the garden. And then at some point later, God gets mad with people again and says, well, tossing them out of the garden didn't do any good, so I'm going to wipe out the whole world. But, I'll keep Noah and his family. And then at some point, God goes, well, I'm not really happy with the world again, but destroying the world didn't really seem to help. So I'll take out a couple of cities. I'll take out Sodom and Gomorrah. And maybe that'll, help people understand. And then the story goes on, and eventually for Christians, it gets to a point where we've got this culmination with Jesus, and God gets to a point and says, well, none of the other stuff has worked, so maybe it's me that needs to die this time. And again, I'm not saying that there's not good moments and sacrificial moments on God's part in the Hebrew scriptures. There are. It's just a very simple survey could see that sort of progression. So all of that leads up to me saying, I don't need to believe that God now acts in the way God did in this story. But our first question is, how does this story sit with your understanding of God, that God is somehow indirectly behind our suffering, as he seems to be with Satan here, in permitting Satan to go off and cause Job to suffer?
It doesn't feel good.
No, it doesn't feel good at all, does it?
No, I find it like hard to accept. I just can't believe, that when you first read it, okay, it doesn't make any sense. And, there's always been questions that I've had about how God seems to be angry in the Old Testament and demanding, and so loving in the New Testament. And so, when I read this passage, I thought of God and what he suffered, because it is the Trinity. It was his son, but he's part of his son, just like we're part of our kids. And he had he gave Jesus as a sacrifice, as an offering to save us. So I've always thought, okay, God knows something about suffering.
Right.
He has suffered. Jesus has suffered. He was tempted by the devil. And God knew this. God knew what the future, is. He knew what his son would have to go through. And ultimately the supreme sacrifice, done.
Right.
So that kind of helps me put it in, like, I feel like, okay, God can empathize a little bit because he's experienced it.
I understand that, but the vision of a vengeful God is troubling. It's not, it's not the Sunday school story that we liked having, is it? And Colin, when you went through that list of things, like it just, it's probably sacrilegious to say, but it sounds like a little 9-year-old stomping his feet and saying, "Well, I'm mad, so you're out." And I'm mad, and I have the power to destroy the world, and I have the power to destroy a city, and that's not who we want to put our trust and our faith in.
Mhm.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, um, if if that's really God's personality, then I would want to trust in that.
No.
I look at the actions of the American president. I think, well, I don't want to trust in that, right?
No way.
We don't want a leader, somebody who's going to help us set direction for our lives to be having temper tantrums.
And sick his powers on us, which
Right.
is kind of what's happening in the U.S. too, isn't it?
Right.
I'm king, so I'll send out the army to get you because you made me angry, and that's kind of how this that's not how this story feels, but that's how Noah feels. That's how the Garden of Eden feels. Like, I'm mad and I have more power than you, so. But in this case, it doesn't feel like God was wielding his power. Was he? Was he tempting Satan? I mean, at that point, Satan was still a good guy.
Yeah.
He was testing the waters, but he was one of the, what did it say, the heavenly group.
Right.
So was that kind of a trial for Satan to see if he was, was gracious and thoughtful and compassionate and kind? If so, he failed. And then, is this when he got kicked out?
Well, yeah, I don't know. I'm gonna have to go and do some research on when in the story that change in Satan's character happens. But the interesting thing for me in what you just said, Linda, was often we would see this as a test for Job.
Mm-hmm.
Right? When we have things go wrong, we think it's a test for us to some degree, right?
Yep.
But the question that you threw out is, was this a test for Satan?
Mm-hmm.
Which then gets me thinking, so maybe God had full confidence in Job. Now, again, all of the destructive pieces that fit into the story, I don't know yet how to unpack that. But if God had full confidence in Job in being able to deal with this, and it wasn't a test for Job, it was a test for Satan, that's going to give me something else to think about with the story.
And didn't, God tested Adam and Eve.
Yep.
And they failed as well.
Yep.
And as a consequence, we must suffer. So, it seems like there's a lot of testing going on. And as scripture says in Job, it says that, or rather the narrative that you sent around, that, okay, I lost my train of thought. I was talking about the test. I just lost it. I'll have to come back to it, but I think about original sin,
Right.
and so we are suffering. We didn't obey God. Job didn't obey God. But okay, does it have something to do with our level of faith? So I wonder about that as well.
But Job, too, as far as the story is being told, was a good and upright man who did trust and obey God.
Yeah.
And his whole life was destroyed to, potentially to prove somebody else wrong.
Yeah.
Who knows why? But that's a question that gets asked all the time, doesn't it? I mean, people must ask that when a cyclone destroys their city, or when a plague destroys millions of people. Why? Why is this happening? And is this an act of God, or is this punishment or a judgment upon us?
Yeah. I've facetiously said a number of times that God doesn't like trailer parks.
Right, right.
You know, that the tornadoes will go right past a solid building and turn left
Right.
and take out a trailer park.
And
Why?
people are forgiven for saying why. It's
Yeah.
not understandable.
Yeah. So we've been edging into that second question that I sent, which is, what do you think of the idea that God doesn't give us more than we can handle? And I'll say from my experience, when I'm in the midst of those times that I think God has given me more than I can handle, hearing those words are not helpful.
No. That was a favorite saying of Bill's mother's, and I always rather cringed.
Yeah.
I just, and well, we kind of talked about that the other day. I do believe, beyond the question of whether God sent bad things to happen, I do believe when bad things happen, that God helps us cope and deal and survive.
Yes.
But did he set us up? I don't I don't really want to go there. I'm very ostrich-like in some of my understanding of these stories. I just hide my head in the sand and say, well, I didn't care for that one.
But I think we have made you kind of make a choice, because you have faith. If you believed that God was doing this on purpose all the time, and if I believed that, I would not have faith. I know that for sure. I do think that for the most part, we are able to handle what is handed to us. But then I think about people, again, talked about this the other day, who their entire lives are affected. They're never the same again, or they do the ultimate, which is to commit suicide. And so how do you explain that? Is it a question of faith? I don't think in that case it would be a question of faith, but that kind of crosses my mind.
Right.
It's kind of like the glass half full or the glass half empty person.
Right. Right. And I know when I come out of those times of trial, I can look back and I can I can reframe the situation in a way where I can say, God was with me and God helped me, and God put that person and this circumstance in my life so that um, I'm really awful at doing that in the midst of the situation. But afterwards, I can go back and reframe it that way. But I think often we when we're dealing particularly with somebody else who's in an awful circumstance, we want to reframe it for them so quickly that we rush to a platitude like, well, God doesn't give you more than you can handle. And they can't even handle what they've got, let alone the concept of there could be more.
My fear about that statement, and I agree with you, I think that it's the timing of it. But my fear of it is that if you don't handle it, and some people don't, some people sink into a depression that is unbeatable, then I don't want them to say, well, it's your fault.
Right.
And for me, that's kind of the corollary, like if somebody says, well, God doesn't give you anything you can't handle, and you can't handle it, then you're messed up.
Right.
And really, you're just hurting.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I also think that, when we do have trials and tribulations, if you get through it, there's something always to be learned. You almost have to do like an autopsy of the situation and just look back and think, okay, that's why so-and-so came into my life. That's why I found this passage at a certain time. The various things that coincidentally, and I've harped on this all, even to the congregation, that I really don't believe in coincidences anymore. And so I have to think about what are those things that touched me while I was going through whatever bad event, whatever tribulation, and how did I get to the other side?
Mm-hmm.
And you can.
Is that what you're, and are you then saying, what did I learn through that?
What I learned, but also how I was helped.
Okay.
Whether, and I do believe that if a person came into my life that helped me during that time, I don't think that they just accidentally came into my life. There was a reason why they came. There was a reason that I benefited from that, from their,
Right.
intervention in my life, however that was. And you just look at things differently when you do that, and you realize, okay, it was difficult, it was hard, I got through. And well, I've said this before too, as a person with, fairly strong faith, I think, I look at it, okay, God sent that person. God gave me the strength. He held me up while I went through this. I think of what's that little poem about the feet in the sand?
Oh, footprints. Yes.
Footprints in the sand.
Yeah.
So I think of that, and it helps me, and it strengthens my faith as a result.
Yeah.
I can go there, and I think I feel the same way as you do. Where I falter is looking back on it and saying, well, what did I learn from that? What was God trying to tell me? I'm convinced that I can go there. I'm not convinced that it was engineered by God. Bad things happen. There was that wonderful book that was written by that Kushner, was that his name, a Jewish
Yeah.
rabbi?
Rabbi Kushner. Yep.
terrible, terrible things happen to people who are good people.
Mhm.
And I don't believe that God is the engineer of that. I believe that He is the support.
Yes, I agree.
Yeah, yeah. That would be where I would fall out too. You know, it's not um, to me, it's not a case of God's either indirectly behind our suffering or the outright cause of our suffering or any of that. Um, I think it's a case of God is there in the midst of the crap of life to help us through it. And sometimes that is that people come into our lives at the or circumstances change in the right way at the right moment, that that seem unexplainable at the time or even unexplainable afterwards. Um, and and so, you know, again, we try and reframe that in a way that helps us deal with it. So yeah, it like I said, these aren't easy questions. It's not meant that we're going to sort of tie this up with a neat bow at the end of it and all is good now. But life's not like that either. I wish it was more often. You know, at the end of the day, everything was tied up nice and neat, and you woke up the next day and you carried on with a new package, right?
Yep.
But that's not life. That's not faith. Life and faith are dealing with the muck of what happens, and how do we get through that? How do we help others through that? How do we let others help us through that even? So
Yeah, and I think that, you know, as you were saying, Linda, you don't like that adage about God will only give what put you through what you can handle. But I think it is important to, if you're going to help someone to understand, you need to get them to reflect on what has happened. They're going to come to the other side eventually. But what do you notice along the way? What are the good things, good people, perhaps that came into your life and just they were there, and it was kind of surprising that they were there. So I think that that would be the thing to advise. Just look to see who's in your life, or even the actions that you feel you have to do. You know, that can also be part of it. You think of these things that you wouldn't have thought of before because you've never had to go through a situation like you are going through. And where did those ideas come from? Well,
yeah. Okay. Anything else on our first bit of Job? We've got Job for another few weeks, so
It's the story of why the expression "he has the patience of Job." I miss that in this story. Yes.
we're gonna get there, kind of.
oh, well, I
So,
guess testing us, Colin. That's the way I look at it.
well, I read there's a new book that came out just in the last couple of days by a biblical scholar, and he's talking about the COVID-19 pandemic, and he writes one paragraph about Job, and we'll get to that later in the Bible study, like in an upcoming week. But he basically says, yeah, the story ends up unresolved. So we've got a number of weeks to be unresolved with Job, but we've got a number of years to be unresolved with life. So that's where we're at.
If we have the patience of Job, we'll get through it.
You got it.
Well, his story rather minimizes any complaints that I have currently.
Does it ever?
Yeah. So, well,
Well,
thank you for joining me today, and we'll pick things up again next week. Thank
perfect.
you.
All
Thank
right.
you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.